Okay, I think we're going to kick it off. A few people just still trickling in, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks everybody for joining us. We've got a packed room tonight for this very interesting conversation on the Colorado River. So I'm really grateful that everybody is here with us. My name is Chris Winter. I'm the Executive Director of the Getches-Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment here at Colorado Law School. That's a mouthful, but you can just know us as GWC. We're the Environmental Law Center here at Colorado Law School. We're a research institute focused on natural resources, which means water across the West, which we'll be talking about tonight, public lands, and other natural resources and energy issues. We also invest heavily in the mentorship and development of the amazing student leaders here at Colorado Law School. So we really have an incredible program here, and so many of our students care so deeply about these issues. So it's a real privilege to work with the students here day in and day out. And we also really love bringing these kinds of programs to our community here on campus. We are blessed with an incredible community of leaders on these issues here at Colorado and Boulder and across the rest of the state, and we love featuring speakers for all of you when we get the opportunity. So the rest of this fall, we really have a packed schedule and some unique opportunities. So Amy Cordalis will be here to deliver the Schultz Energy Lecture on September 17th. She just published a book on the recovery of the Klamath River in Southwest Oregon, Northern California. So Amy has an incredible story to tell, so please join us for her lecture. Congressman Joe Neguse will be here to deliver the Ruth Wright Lecture on October 21st, which will be focused on natural resources. And then we have the March Symposium for Public Lands, October 22nd and 23rd. So Congressman Neguse's talk will kick off the Public Land Symposium. So please join us for those events. And then the last thing is we have a newsletter, so please sign up for our newsletter. There's a QR code that's flashing up here. And if you do that, you'll be able to stay up to date on the rest of our events and all the news and other happenings coming out of GWC. So please sign up for the newsletter. All right, so let's get on with the rest of the program for tonight. And it's my pleasure to introduce Mindy Nichols, who is with the Colorado Mountain Club. And Mindy is the Community Outreach and Partnerships Committee Chair for CMC. So please join me in welcoming Mindy.
Well, welcome. I'm so excited that you all are spending your early weekend here with Science Friday. So I appreciate you taking the time out and doing that. We are co-sponsor the event with the GWC because the Colorado Mountain Club believes in conservation, and typically it's been land in the past, but obviously water is a concern these days, especially in the western waters. So we moved into trying to support education on the western waters. I am one of the Boulder group, Colorado Mountain Club council members, and you know, the Boulder group has been with the UC campus for a long time. In 1914, some professors and their associated peers started the hiking club in 1914. They called themselves the High Hikers, and they developed up a lot of the trails up in Chautauqua that are still there today. And then they turned into another hiking group by 1918 called the High Rangers Club, and this was all before vehicles. So they hiked up to El Dorado Springs and Chautauqua. And then in 1920, the Boulder group, Front Range Club, joined with the Colorado Mountain Club. So we have been with the Colorado Mountain Club for a long time in various iterations. Before I introduce Mr. Udall, Brad, to you, let's just think a little bit about what memories, what thoughts, what visions we have of the Colorado River, because we live near it, and I'm sure many of you have gone down it on a boat or fished off its shores or biked along its shores And so we have these images in our mind of what the Colorado River means to us here as we experience our large western water. The Colorado River is 1,450 miles long, right? And it starts right here in our backyard. Anyone know where the headwaters is? Rocky Mountain National Park. More specifically, does anyone know more specifically? Never Summers, right. So it's the headwaters, which is an odd name for someone who's from Washington, and there are big headwaters out there. But the headwaters are in Rocky Mountain National Park, and it flows and gathers more water and goes 1,450 miles, longer than the state of Colorado by quite a bit, down to the Sea of Cortez. And so I'm sure you have vivid memories or ideas of what the river looks like through all the 7 states that it travels down through. I know that food and a good meal probably wasn't one of the things that came to your memory, but as a career dietitian, the food supply has always been a very important part of my education and the way I approached my field. And the Colorado River, especially the lower basin, actually produces 73 trillion calories per year. Just to let you know, you might nerd out on water. I like to nerd out on food and nutrition. So 73 trillion calories per year for our food supply. You know, some of it goes back to New York, of course, but this massive output provides enough nourishment to sustain 40 million people on 500 calories a day. So that gives you, we think about how beautiful the water is and the rocks. We like the rocks in mountain climbing. But the fertile valley that's nourished by the river produces a lot of America's food. And I just needed to say that, I guess. So we are all happy to have Mr. Udall find some time in his very busy professional life to give us a current state of the Colorado River, which we all are quite interested here tonight. I asked Brad the same question as I asked you. What is your experience on the river? Where are your memories? And this man, when he was a younger adolescent young man, 42 times he went down the river on a canyoneering trip, 2-week canyoneering trip. So 42 times, 2 weeks of a session. He spent a lot of time living on that river. So his family has deep ties with the river also that go back 150 years. And for several so you can trace his time, his familial time on the river back to his great-great-grandfather. His name was John D. Lee, and he started the area called Lee's Ferry. And that was his great-great-grandfather, right? So in Arizona, that's a part of Arizona. And from what I can understand, and I think Greg told me it's true that I did ChatGPT it, and he verified that it was true, that Lee's Ferry is the demarcation line between the southern Colorado Basin and the northern Colorado Basin that we're in. So I think that's it. I'm going to let Mr. Udall tell you much more And thank you all for coming.
Wow, what a terrific turnout tonight. Thank you all. This is probably better than some of these other talks, so I'm impressed. Let me add a couple of things on what Mindy said. So you might think that it's hard to be a descendant of John D. Lee, but Lee had 21 wives that we know of. And some have suggested he has 800,000 descendants actually right now, which might actually be part of the problem with the Colorado River. And just for reference, I was actually a river guide with both Ken Slight, Seldom Seen Smith, and Edward Abbey's Monkey Wrench Gang. That's Ken Slight, and also with Grand Canyon Dories. And that's how I managed to actually get 45 trips, 2 years of my life in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And so at the end of this, you're going to get a badge that says you're part historian, part lawyer, part engineer, and now part scientist. And if I could, I'd give you credit for this because this is a really in-depth talk. And frankly, you can't get to the heart of the Colorado River without really digging deep. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. I actually shot this image in October of 2021. It's a defunct car ferry on Lake Powell in Bullfrog Marina. And if you look out in the distance there, it says Lake Powell, right? I mean, you couldn't hit Lake Powell with a rock from my car. You couldn't hit it with an arrow and maybe not even a gun, frankly. And the lake is now lower than when I shot this photo in 2021. The subtitle of this talk, which I think really encompasses what we're all about, a collision, 19th century water law, 20th century infrastructure, and 21st century climate change and population growth. That really epitomizes where we're headed. And before I start, I want to acknowledge two relatives here, my sister Dodie Udall and my sister-in-law Maggie Fox. So former Commissioner of Reclamation Mike Connor, about 15 years ago after I gave a particularly depressing talk, called me the skunk in the room. And it's a moniker I've worn proudly for many, many years. But a year ago in this room, a high-ranking Colorado River official called me Eeyore, which is really a downgrade, right? I mean, here's what Eeyore says. Good morning, Eeyore, said Pooh. Good morning, Pooh Bear, said Eeyore gloomily. If it is a good morning, which I doubt. You know, skunk in the room and Eeyore are very different things in my mind. You know, Eeyore, for example, is bummed out for no good reason. And I, on the other hand, am bummed out for really good reasons. And I'm going to share a bunch of them with you tonight. So let's just look through this problem from a high-level look. This is Arizona Republic just about a week ago, Glen Canyon Dam on life support. 40 million Americans, flows down 20% since 2000, reservoirs down 75%, and they're nearing very critical elevations. The demands have actually decreased thanks to active management, but they're still greater than the flows. It's going to get warmer, and these flows are going to continue to drop. Western water law is enormously complicated and really inhibits solutions. We've made a whole bunch of policy mistakes through time, including permanent allocations, assuming way too much water, and enforcing or legalizing really unrealistic policies. We now have solutions for the next 2 years as of today. The record of decision on the EIS was released today. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. It's really dependent on hydrology. And I want to make this point, which I think is really important. So we've had a number of events around the world involving climate change in the water cycle. Big floods, big droughts, hurricanes. People mostly rebuild, they pick up the pieces, maybe you change a building code, but at the end of the day, everything's kind of the same. Well, I'm going to make the case that this is the first global instance where climate change is forcing a complete redo of water management. And I think I can make a pretty good case for that. All right, so let me just do an overview here. So I want to set the scene, and there's all kinds of stuff here. I really need to spend a little bit of time on terminology, because if I don't, I'm going to start introducing terms that make no sense. And then there's a whole pile of stuff I'm going to go through here that'll be obvious as it occurs. I then want to talk about the science and what it says and why these flows are declining. And also talk a little bit about the global climate problem. And let me hint at the future outcome of this talk. I'm actually pretty optimistic about a solution for the Colorado River. I'm far less optimistic about what's going on globally with climate. And then I'm going to wrap up with a number of slides. All right, so let's dig into some terms. Acre foot, 1 acre, 1 foot of water on top of it, 325,000 gallons. It's the standard by which all people measure water in the West. When reporters use gallons to describe water use, it's like a speed limit in inches per hour. It makes no sense whatsoever if you're actually in this business. And the reason acre foot is used is farmers farm in terms of an acre. And in the upper basin, you might put 1 foot or 2 feet of water on top of an acre to get a hay crop out. In the lower basin, near the Mexico border, you might put 10 feet of water on top of an irrigated field to get 10 different cuttings of alfalfa. So that's sort of an ag perspective. 1 acre foot is 10 people for 1 year. Las Vegas uses 200,000 acre feet for 2 million people, hence the 1 to 10. There's at least a couple anchors for what an acre foot is. Consumptive use versus non-consumptive use. So water is not gasoline. You actually get many cracks at the bat when you use it. If you water something outside and that water evaporates, it's called consumptive use. It's removed from the water cycle. If you use water inside your house and it's in a toilet or a shower, it's actually non-consumptively used, right? It goes off to the sewage plant and is reused locally. So very different concepts of water use. Let me talk about reservoir design issues in dead pools. So this is a cartoon, not to scale of Glen Canyon Dam, but it could be any dam. And what I want to point out is the very bottom here is dead pool, right? And dead pools where we actually lose control of the reservoir. What flows in is what flows out at that point. And if you look in the cartoon, you see the lower outlet there is above dead pool. You can't get any water out of the reservoir. We lose control of it. That's dead pool. Above it is the minimum power pool. And you need that height to run your turbines. And you can see the blue outlet there, that's a penstock that runs to the turbines. Above that's the conservation pool. And that's the pool that fluctuates. Reservoirs aren't designed to stay full. They're designed to fluctuate. And you can actually size them appropriately based, at least in the 20th century when it has stable climate, based on all the flows that come in and out. In the case of the Colorado, lowest years are roughly 5 million acre feet, and the biggest years are 25 million. The average is 15 in the 20th century. And so your reservoir is designed to buffer those high and low years so that you can take the average less evaporation out every year. You can take 15 million out. And then finally, on top of the conservation pool is a flood pool. And the conservation pool is typically huge relative to these other pools, hence the not to scale issue here. Law of the river refers to all of these international treaties, compacts, congressional legislation. I'll go into depth on it. Reclamation means the Bureau of Reclamation, the important federal agency created in 1902 that built all these water projects in the western U.S., and they have incredible responsibilities over the river. Edie Zagona is here with us, works at CU and closely with Reclamation. And actually a bunch of the modeling that Reclamation does is done here in this town. And Reclamation has terrific engineers and scientists working for them. I'm gonna talk about upper basin and lower basin. Sometimes in these slides, you'll see UB and LB. Natural flow at Lee's Ferry. So the river has something very interesting that, as far as I know, is not repeated anywhere else in the world. Reclamation goes to great lengths to create what we call natural flow at Lee Ferry, the dividing line between the upper and lower basin. Natural flow is the flow that would occur in the absence of humans. And it's incredibly useful for policy decisions and science as well. And most of the time when I talk about flow, it'll be about the natural flow. And then CRB just means Colorado River Basin. All right, so quick geography here. Here's a map. Upper basin, lower basin split there in the middle. 7 states, 2 nations, 30 tribes, 15 million at Lee Ferry in the 20th century. You can see Lee Ferry right there below Glen Canyon Dam. Every major city in the southwest US depended on this river. It's half the water here in the Front Range, 40% in Phoenix, 25% in LA Basin. It makes its way to Albuquerque and Santa Fe, Salt Lake. It's pretty incredible where it all goes. 4.5 million irrigated acres, and ag uses about 3/4 of the water. And winter veggies and leafy greens get produced down on the Arizona, California, on the Mexico border, Imperial District there, and in Yuma as well, and also in Mexico, actually. Withdrawals greater than supplies in 2000, and for about 50 years, it actually hasn't freely flowed to the ocean. We utilize every last drop. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Gila. It's in Arizona, and it's a big basin, Gila Salt Verde system. It's really incredible. It's important to the history of the river that we understand the Gila. And I just want to point out it's kind of half of Arizona. All right, so let's look at these reservoirs. Here's the combined contents of the nation's 2 largest reservoirs, Powell and Meade. And basically, this is where only Meade exists. This is when Glen Canyon and Lake Powell start to fill. This is, it gets full in the early 90s, the 90 drought, and here's where we start this drought we're in right now. And you can see this plummeting down. In January 2000, they're basically full right there. By August of this year, they're about 25% full. We've lost 34 million acre feet in that period, or 1.25 million acre feet a year. And this 1.25 million number is going to repeatedly show up during the talk, so remember it. There you go. All right, so just this month, both Powell and Meade hit record lows. And here's a newspaper article, and this is actually now Meade. It looks real similar to that last plot, but it's only Lake Meade. The x-axis, the y-axis here is only about half the size. These 2 reservoirs are about equivalent. Meade slightly bigger. And so this area here should look pretty familiar. Where are we now? You get to go back to the Great Depression to find Meade this low. And if I had an image of Powell, it would look much like this. All right, let's talk about these declines over the last 27 years. And I'm going to show you a number of images that look like this. And let me describe what's on here. So the annual data is this squiggly lines in gray. The 20th century mean sits here. Interesting. Well, one of my lines is missing, but that's the 20th century mean. I'll show you in a second where we have been recently. The blue line is a moving average, and that's the line I really want you to pay attention to. And then the 2000s are in this gray area over here. It's called a low S smooth. It's a fancy statistical moving average. So how different are the recent years from the last century? So the mean in the 20th century was 15.2. You can see it there. It's down 21%. The recent mean so over the last 27 years is 12. And what's really scary here is in the last 7 years, we're down at 10 million acre feet. 10 million acre feet. We have half as many high flow years and 2.5 times as many low flow years. And the take home here is there's no analog to this in the 20th century. These flows are completely different. Colorado is known as the headwater state, and the size of these rivers indicate how much water they have in them. This is out of our state engineer. And the main point here I want to make is that Colorado River, it's the biggest river by far, and especially when you include all its tributaries, which are basically everything there on the west slope, west of the Rio Grande. And 90% of what flows out of this state is actually in the Colorado River. And maybe Wyoming can claim to be a headwater state, but there's otherwise no other state like our state. So why is this important to all of us in this room? So about 400,000 acre feet a year of this water finds its way into the east slope through a variety of what we call trans-basin or trans-mountain diversions. So there's a project that Boulder has an interest in called the Colorado Big Thompson, and it takes the lion's share of it. So Boulder Reservoir, Carter Lake, Horsetooth Reservoir are all CBT reservoirs. If you see the lakes up in Lake Estes, that's where the tunnel comes out in Estes Park. It starts over in Grand Lake, quite a project. Denver Water takes 150,000 acre feet through 2 tunnels, one at Moffett. If you ever ski up or hike up at the Moffett Tunnel, the railroad tunnel, right next to it is the water tunnel that Denver Water uses to get water to this side of the divide. And the other bigger tunnel that Denver uses is the Roberts Tunnel, and it flows from Lake Dillon, the arm near Keystone, all the way under the mountains to 285, Highway 285 near Grant. And you probably drive by it all the time on your way to Kenosha and don't even notice it as it dumps water into the North Fork of the South Platte. And then Aurora and Colorado Springs, also heavily dependent, 400,000 acre feet. Half of the water we use here is Colorado River water. So this is a lengthy slide, and I kind of apologize, but here's the signing of the Colorado River Compact in 1922. And I want to note it was signed but not ratified. And there's really important history here that set the states up, I would argue, for a whole lot of conflict. So in 1928, the Boulder Canyon Project Act is actually passed by Congress. And this act comes about because Arizona refuses to sign the compact because of a dispute over the geographic boundaries on the river. And the geographic boundaries, specifically that Gila River I showed you earlier. The Boulder Canyon Project Act makes Hoover Dam a reality. It funds it, and ultimately in 1964, the Supreme Court will decide that that act actually allocated the waters of the 3 lower basin states, Nevada, California, and Arizona. 1944, there's a treaty with Mexico. They get 1.5 million acre feet. 1948, the Upper Colorado River Compact is signed. So the 4 upper states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, make a compact, and they get smart. They decide that they're not going to put firm, hard, fixed numbers. They're going to do their allocation via percentages. Colorado, roughly speaking, gets half, Utah about a quarter, Wyoming and New Mexico split the difference. So 1964, there's a huge suit between Arizona and California to determine what the rights are, what the allocations are in the lower basin. And I've got a lengthy slide on this that'll describe exactly what the Supreme Court decided and why it's so important to the history of the river. In 1968, yet another act gets passed by Congress that provides funding for the Central Arizona Project Act. And I call it the CAP Act, although that's not really the name of it. And I will tell you right now, this is not a highlight in Udall family history. In 2007, the interim guidelines come about, and these are the first time the basin states figure out how to allocate shortages if there's not enough water around, and in 2019, those shortages are added upon. So more details to follow here, and here we sit in 2026, and we're trying to get new rules to replace 2007 and 2019. And let me make one point here. So the rules in 2007 and 2019 were really hard fought, but they were incremental. They were truly incremental. What we're looking at right now, it's not incremental. It's a complete rethink, and hence the difficulties in getting a new agreement. This is really a different deal in 2026. And I think people mistakenly thought that given the successes in 2007, 2019, we would just kind of waltz our way to new rules. And I think that's the wrong way to think about what's gone on here. All right, so let's dig deep into the compact. And before I start, I want to say every one of these provisions has some major dispute about it that's gone on since 1922. And our commissioner, Becky Mitchell, has recently been saying, you know, none of this gets us any extra water. And we need to move beyond this. And I applaud Becky for saying that. So the geographic scope. So they split the basin in 2, right? We already know that. The entire basin was allocated, so it included the Gila. But Arizona objected because the Gila in 1922 was basically fully allocated. I mean, it was almost completely used up. And there's a little important piece of history here in 1922. So in the middle of 1922, as the compact was being negotiated, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling in Wyoming v. Colorado that said it would apply the doctrine of prior appropriation, first in time, first in trust, right, across state lines. And it gave water to Wyoming that Colorado had tried to take later. And that scared the compact negotiators into getting the job done by November of 2022. The reason I mention this is by that logic, Arizona had the right to the Gila before the 22 compact was signed, right? Article 3 is the guts of the compact. It gives 7.5 million acre feet to each basin for beneficial consumptive use. Note consumptive use there. Beneficial consumptive use was never defined. The whole compact's on 4 pages. 4 pages. Can you imagine an interstate compact on 4 pages today? I mean, that's not even the whereases. So an extra million was given to the lower basin. It didn't have Arizona's name on it, but it was clearly intended to try and satisfy Arizona over the Gila. There's a 3C talks about when we make a treaty with Mexico, it didn't exist. It'll either come from surplus, or if not, each basin will contribute half. And this whole notion of surplus then becomes a contention later because the upper basin thinks the Gila is going to provide surplus and that it's going to get the upper basin out of sharing any extra water from Mexico. And then here's kind of the kicker of the compact, the real problem. So Article 3D is sort of an anti-hoarding clause, and basically it says that at Lee's Ferry, on a 10 running year basis, the upper basin can't deplete the river so that it falls below 75 million acre feet every 10 running years. In the 20th century, before climate change was really thought about and considered, this clause was interpreted as a delivery obligation, a hard, fixed delivery obligation on the part of the upper basin. But as soon as climate change comes along, you can't apply that logic because now there's 2 ways the flow can fall below 75 million acre feet. Either the upper basin uses it or climate change reduces it. And so this is hanging out here where nobody understands what this means right now. And this year, a version of this is going to come into play because flows at Lee's Ferry will drop below 82.5 million every 10 years, which is the 75 million plus half the Mexico Treaty obligation. I think it's September, although it may have already happened. So kind of an interesting times we live in, eh? Tribal water rights completely excluded. Even though in 1908, the Supreme Court ruled that Native Americans were entitled to a water right, and there's no mention of environmental flows. All right, so let's go on to 1964. Basically, Arizona sued California like 4 times, and finally on the 4th time, the Supreme Court would hear it. In 1952, they agreed to hear it to settle who owned what water rights in the lower basin, notwithstanding the 1928 Boulder Canyon Project Act, which actually had an allocation in it. It's a 12-year case, 100 different witnesses, a 3-year trial. A special master is appointed by the Supreme Court to hear this. Disputes between the states go right to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court obviously can't deal with this, so they appoint a retired judge. The first one dies, actually, before this thing gets done, and so a second one is appointed. It's a trial of the century. So what comes out of it? So Supreme Court says Boulder Canyon Project Act actually allocated the waters in the lower basin, 4.4 million to California, 2.8 to Nevada, Nevada 300,000 acre feet. It says Arizona is allowed to use all tributary water without limitation. We're back to the Gila, right? It provided 5 Arizona tribes with a bunch of water, and importantly, it gives the Department of Interior Secretary authority to portion lower basin water during drought. And with these lower basin allocations settled, Congress is now able to go forth and authorize the Central Arizona Project, which the Arizona congressional delegation had been fighting for years, but Congress wouldn't take it up because nobody knew who had how much water. And again, I just highlight just how important this is, because all of a sudden, the Department of Interior Secretary is the water master in the lower basin. All right. So 1968, 4 years later, here's the signing of that Central Arizona Project bill. And what a different world this is, right? And there's one woman in this. Lady Bird Johnson, President's wife. President Johnson seated at the table. The senior man there is Senator Carl Hayden of Arizona, who'd been in the U.S. Congress since 1912, Arizona statehood, pushing for this. So I have two relatives, actually, in this photograph. So right behind Senator Hayden is my uncle, Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall. And then over there on the right, that really tall guy with the big ears, my wife says, I think uncharitably, is my father. That's Moe or Morris Udall. You know, and as I said earlier, this was not the highlight of their careers. I think we're going to kind of get into why this act has created so many problems. But it's a great photograph. All right, so let's talk about the Central Arizona Project. You can see the canal there arcing through the desert, right, in the upper, and then you can see the layout. It goes from Lake Havasu all the way down to Tucson, 336 miles, 3,000 vertical feet, 400 megawatts of electric power to take all that water into Arizona. So Arizona wanted this canal forever. It took 20 years to build. It's the only way for Arizona to use its allocation. There just isn't enough, there weren't enough people, and there won't be enough people on the river itself. It serves Phoenix, Tucson, tribes agriculture, $4 billion. And it's at 1.6 million acre feet per year. So it's the lion's share of Arizona's 2.8 allocation, right? And here's the kicker. So Arizona had 3 congressional representatives. My father was one of them. California had 35. How do you think this got through the House? Well, it got through the House because Arizona gave up a lot. They made CAP junior to California. If there was ever a shortage, you would drain CAP. CAP would go to 0 before California felt any shortage whatsoever. That was the agreement in 1968. And this report, 3 years earlier, helped that agreement come into place. So this was done by the Upper Colorado River Commission, an entity that's associated, it oversees the upper basin. And this is a report out of a Denver-based engineer that said there's not enough water for CAP once the upper basin grows into its full allocation. And you can see the number right there circled down below, about 1.2 million acre feet per year. And if you remember way back to the beginning of this talk, how much per year have the reservoirs lost? About 1.25 million acre feet a year. Those two numbers are actually related. So the idea here in 1968 is that CAP water was initially going to come from unused upper basin allocation until such time as the feds could augment the river with 2.5 million acre feet of water. And the idea here was that the feds would assume the Mexico delivery obligation plus add some water on top. And where they were going to get this was Hobag Junction, just south of Jackson on the Snake River. Because there's about 5 million acre feet right there in the Snake. And they sort of thought, oh, we'll just grab half of that, put it over the divide into the green, and let it run down to CAP. Guess what? The Pacific Northwest Congressional Delegation didn't like that very much. And like in the first 2 paragraphs of this bill, it's completely at odds with itself. Basically, we're going to allocate the river, and guess what? You can't even study allocation. I mean, that's like in the first page of the bill. That was one of the prohibitions to get this passed that the Pacific Northwest delegation insisted on. What really happened here is the upper basin never grew into its full allocation. It only uses about 60% of its compact allocation, but instead the flows dropped out. And so we ended up in exactly the same place. And guess what? augmentation past 1968 was completely forgotten. All right, so let's talk about the 2007 interim guidelines. I took that lower picture in 2021. The upper picture is a stock photo. They're in the same place. You don't believe it, there's a rock in the foreground in the stock photo that is in the lower photo too. So you have Lake Powell full and Lake Powell well on its way down. So I don't know if you remember, but my picture of the reservoir content showed this precipitous drop from 2000 to 2004 at the beginning of this. We lost half of the storage, and we didn't have any rules if it kept dropping down. And so Secretary Gerald Norton insisted the states come up with a plan. And ultimately, this plan it went really quickly through an EIS, a record of a decision. And what it did was it set lower basin shortages up to 500,000 acre feet per year, mostly centered on Arizona, right, because of the cap issue. And it also created rules for release amounts from Powell to Meade, because how we operate these reservoirs are really important. With Powell above Lee Ferry, the 3D, the 75 million acre foot area where we measure that water. And these rules expire this year. So the drought contingency plans come on after that event over in my slide. So that's 2012 and 2013. Single biggest year is on the left side of it's the up bleep, 20 million acre foot runoff. And then we lose it all in 2 years. And actually, that's the story. If you really look at this plot, that's the story. Every big year is followed by one or more awful years, and we get put in a worse position. So what's the DCP do? It ups the 500,000 shortages to 1.2. And it's mostly lower basin focused, but notice the S in plans. And one of the plans is the upper basin is going to ride to the rescue via federal reservoirs if ever needed, and reservoirs like Flaming Gorge will release water to Powell if it ever looks like it's not going to have enough water in it. And that's exactly what happened this year. And again, expires 2026. All right, so I want to talk about winner take all Western water allocation, prior appropriation, because this is also a thing that doesn't work real well in the 21st century. So this idea includes prior appropriation plus what I'd call CAP, because CAP has a senior and a junior user, right? Part of the problem with Western water law is agricultural rights are generally more senior than cities. That's true in this state, in California, and Colorado. First in time, first in right gets reinvented by 4-year-olds every day of the year throughout the world. I was here first, it's mine. And most parents step in and say you're going to share, right? But not Western water law. Completely understandable in the 1800s where you had a few users and, people in one area had to figure out who got what water and who didn't. But it's really not so great for modern society. And, much of prior appropriation in the West, junior users have built reservoirs and other ways to manage their risk. But in an era of climate change, those reservoirs and other systems don't work anymore. Those reservoirs that Denver Water has don't work anymore. They won't get any water. And you can't have a case where 1,500 farmers deprive 5 million people in Phoenix or 2 million people in the Front Range of water, of what I'll call critical human water needs. It isn't going to work politically. And so shared sacrifice would be a whole lot better way to deal with this, but unfortunately we're really stuck unless we get very creative on fixing this. Does anybody recognize this structure? It's on I-70. So it's the roller dam just outside of Grand Junction in Debec Canyon. It's a pre-compact water right, pre-1922 water right, which gives it seniority over every senior Front Range user. It takes 1,600 CFS. if water ever got really short, in theory, it takes water and we get zero on the Front Range. I mean, it just ain't gonna work. There's an inside joke about prior appropriation. You know, the whole goal of prior appropriation is supposed to deal with shortages, right? And the joke goes like this: it works really well, except during drought. All right, so this maps all the Indian tribes in the basin. There are 30 of them. 1908, Supreme Court says tribes deserve a right, called the Federal Reserve Water Right. Tribes were completely left out of the compact in 1922. There's all of one sentence in there about tribes. In 1964, in the Supreme Court lawsuit, the Supreme Court actually came up with a standard, and they basically said, hey, we meant these Native American people to be farmers, so they get a water right enough to irrigate the lands on their reservation. Turns out that's actually a lot of water on some of these reservations. In the case of Arizona, it's a huge chunk. And it's sort of interesting to me that these tribes are a federal responsibility, but the way Western water law works is that the tribes get water out of the state share, right? And I think you can make a case that Arizona, with 22 tribes, gets unfairly burdened with this, right? Tribes control about a quarter of all water in the basin. There's something like 12 more of these settlements out of 30 to resolve. And I want to hammer home this unique position of Arizona. You've seen hints of it in some of these slides. So here's Roosevelt Dam, 2 million acre foot dam, big dam on the Salt, just above Phoenix. It's really why Phoenix exists, the Salt River. You know, people think of Arizona as a desert, but there's actually a big uplift in the middle of it that captures winter rains and some snow quite effectively. And again, it's why the Hohokam settled Phoenix. It's why Phoenix actually has the name Phoenix. It's really important, the salt. And of course, so half the state's hot, dry desert, that's where people live, 7 million people. So Arizona's got what you call egg carton geology underneath it, and there's massive quantities of groundwater in that state, enough for 100 years sometimes. I argue it's globally unique. I dare you to find another place like this on the planet. So that's great. It allows you to build a city of 5 million people for 100 years. There's one river system, this Gila Salt, it's fully used. It was fully used by 1922, 22 tribes I mentioned. What Arizona has been doing in recent years before CAP got cut back starting around 2020 was using that water to actually recharge these aquifers. And they have these basins in the state where they put water on out there, and like 6 hours later, it's gone. And so their aquifers are like underground reservoirs. They're actually really effective. But now with CAP being threatened, this whole way that they have to make their state sustainable and to utilize groundwater falls apart. And CAP it's 40% of the water in Phoenix, 80% in Tucson, but again, junior to California and junior to these Arizona-based Yuma farmers. So what about use? This is water use 1970 through 2020, and kind of complicated, but let me walk you through it. Total use is 16 million in 2000 right there at the arrow. 13 million in 2025 over at the right-hand edge, so big reduction, right? So since 2020, there's been about 1 million acre foot per year reduction in total use on the basin. In the lower basin, both compensated. Inflation Reduction Act had a bunch of money that was spent on paying people not to take water, and these reductions are also forced by those 2007 and 2019 agreements. And if you look at 2025, lower basin is now with losses at 6.8 under their compact entitlement, and they're on that arrow. Upper basin at 4.5. And the one thing I want to point out about the upper basin is look, since 1990, completely flat. And this has kind of been a sore point with the upper basin, especially recently. It's like, we were promised this, we need to grow into it. And it's, my feeling is it's almost musical chairs. You don't have a chair right now. Sorry, upper basin. There is no water. We probably made a big mistake making these permanent allocations, but there just isn't water for you to grow anymore. And Mexico, of course, uses about 1.7, and we still have an annual imbalance of roughly 3 million acre feet. So how do I get that number? So 13 million there, and the flow at the last 7 years is about 10. It's actually more like 11 because there's a bunch of water that flows in the Grand Canyon. So maybe that should say 2. Let's put that at 2. How about how's this water get used? So if you look at total uses kind of along the river, about 30% is actually riparian reservoir evaporation. And you can see it there, but I actually think it's far better to just look at human uses because that's what we control. 25% municipal and industrial, 75%. Half of this is alfalfa and hay, and maybe we can get into that in questions. Kind of a complicated topic. All right, so what about infrastructure limitations? Here's Glen Canyon Dam, current at 3519 at 5.3 million acre feet or 23%. Minimum power pool is at 3490, and you can see it here on the picture from when it was filling. These are the penstock inlets. The water goes to the turbines. 3490 minimum power pool, 3370 dead. Reclamation says we need to keep it at 3500 really to protect those penstocks. They can't suck air. And interestingly, that's 19 feet away, right? And these things are the river outlets. You can see them lower. And in theory, if the reservoir dropped below the penstocks, you could use those, but it turns out you actually can't use them. They're never designed for day in, day out use. And what we now have at Glen Canyon is what I'm calling dead pool light. I mean, we're not anywhere near dead pool, but because we got to stay at 3,500 and we're 19 feet away from that, if you hit 3,500, what flows in is what's going to flow out, dead pool light. Importantly, this reservoir is backup power for Palo Verde Nuclear Power Plant, the nation's either first or second largest producer of nuclear energy, electricity, with 3 different units in Phoenix. And if you think backup power is not important, think back to Fukushima. The Japanese designed a critical piece of that infrastructure such that it was underwater after the tsunami. And if that infrastructure had been above water, Fukushima wouldn't have happened. Backup power is a really big deal, and maybe you can find another source, but it's not anything to be trifled with. So here's Hoover. You can see the intake towers. You can see minimum power at 950 according to reclamation, dead pool at 895. But here's sort of interesting thing about Hoover. So it's at 1040 right now, but there's actually 2 minimum power pools at Hoover. There's one at 1035, 5 feet lower, where we lose 70% of the power. And the other one is down there at 950. Now, power has never been a key driver in the basin, and it's 1% of the grid, something like these 2 dams. We can replace it, but it's not, it has some issues associated with it. So infrastructure, 20th century infrastructure, right? 19th century water law meets 20th century infrastructure. So what's the science say? I'm going to talk about that image, of which you've seen one part, the flow reductions, and then I'm going to talk about all this other stuff in this next section. So let's talk about temperatures. So they're up 3 Fahrenheit since 1970. That's almost 6 Fahrenheit in 100 years. And if you look there, not a single year after 2000 is below the 20th century average. Increased temps lead to increased evaporation, which leads to less flow. It's a pretty simple equation. And we think you can lose up to 5% flow per degree Fahrenheit. And so the quick math here is maybe we've lost 15% due to evaporation. That's probably high. And these temperature increases are obviously caused by humans. Temperature is going to increase throughout our century, unfortunately. So what about precip? So the last 27 years is the worst 27-year period since 1895. It's 9% down. 2018 there circled as the single worst year going back to 1895. The decline worsened around 2015. You can see that blue line's kind of got an inflection point. And the last 7 years are actually the lowest average in the record for precipitation. The highs are lower than many 20th century highs. So they're all the highs. And let's look at the highs in the 20th century. Very different, right? And the lows are also really different than the lows in the 20th century. They're 3 times more frequent. And I'll just note that a 1% decline in precip leads to a 2% decline in flow. So if you've got a 9% on average, that's 18% decline in flow. And those two numbers curiously add up to about 35%, which is sort of ballpark where we are. So, I mean, these key points: lowest precipitation since 1895, the whole thing shifted downward. Decline is probably human caused. A lot of interesting science on this. And if that's the case, it's likely to continue. All right, so I want to compare 2 versions of this. I made this in 2014 for a paper with Jonathan Overpeck. That's the 2014 version. Here's the 2026 version. It's kind of interesting to look at this. All right, so that's the additional loss in reservoir storage, that red circle on the right there. So we lost an additional 25% since 2014. Here's the natural flows, and I want you to concentrate on the blue lines. The natural flows in 2014 kind of looked like they'd stopped declining, right? But look over at the right-hand side, you hit that inflection point around 2015, and it actually steepens there. What about precipitation? So in 2014, it was really interesting because we couldn't explain the 20% decline in flow based on the lack of precipitation. That's just a subtle decline there, that blue line. But look over where we are now. Again, the inflection point around 2015 where precipitation drops precipitously. And what about temperatures? Well, in 2014, they kind of look like they're leveling off. I mean, nobody really believed that, but they kind of do. And then in the 2026 version, man, they're off to the races again, right? March was the warmest in 132 years. Every dark color here set a record. The darker the color, the more the records. Much of this centered on the Colorado River Basin. 9 degrees warmer. Every Colorado River Basin state had the warmest March. It was really dry too, and you can see it in this image. And this is super interesting if you're a climate geek, although very depressing. So we now have areas where March record high temperatures now exceed April record high temperatures. I mean, that's completely backwards, right? And this image actually kind of demonstrates that. So this is in Fort Collins. The earliest 90-degree day in Fort Collins prior to this March was in May. It jumped a whole month. It's now in March. And the upper basin temperatures were really, really warm, even warmer than another warm year. So here's snowpack. The red line is the lowest ever year. Black line's 2026. So in early March, all of a sudden these 90-degree temperatures hit, snowpack's at 60%, basically lowest ever, and it plummets. We lose more than half of it. The thing that bailed us out here, and I think it's part of the reason why Colorado hasn't got really whacked by fires this summer, is it turned wet actually from April to mid-May. And that's really curious. And there's half a chance it's associated with this upcoming El Nino, although that's a bit of a reach. So what about projections for flows and temperatures? USGS scientists say, depending on where precipitation goes, maybe an increase to maybe 40% decrease. And Jeff Lucas is here tonight, who authored this report out of the Western Water Assessment, suggested that there's a strong tendency toward lower runoff in 2020. Upper basin temperatures, another 2 Fahrenheit by 2060. And let me just note, we are well on our way to what we call aridification here. So this isn't a drought, it's aridification. It's the long-term warming and drying in the American West. I call it a drought, but I should say aridification, but it's a little hard. And there's a whole list of stuff here associated with aridification, every one of which is bad, unless you're a big fan of more severe fires. And want to briefly talk about this. I'm not delving too deeply into the science, but Jeff and I and Tanya Pitak, Julie Vano keep this website going, Colorado River Science Wiki. And if you're at all want to geek out on science, there's a lifetime worth of information there. All right, let's talk about this upcoming El Nino, because this is kind of interesting, right? Super El Nino headed, wettest winter ever, some have suggested. So here are 120 dots, one for each year from 1906 to 2025. And each dot represents two things: Colorado River flow and the state of El Nino. So on the left axis here is what we call, it's an El Nino index called Nino 3.4. And basically the way this works is the bottom of this chart's La Nina, the top's El Nino, and we've got low flows on the left and high flows on the right. And there's no relationship here, right? I mean, I dare you to find a relationship between El Nino and flows at Lead Ferry based on the historical record. I'm not telling you we might not get a great winter, but there's nothing in this. There are three super interesting points. So there are top 12 El Ninos, and there's no pattern in them. There are three interesting dots in there, though, and I'll get to them in a second. So if you look at the high flows, just nobody's asking this question, but what gives you high flows? Arguably, more of those high flows are down in La Nina. And so there's two really big Nino 3-4 years, 1998 and 1983. If we had those, we'd be happy, but for 1 year. And then the other one, 2016, no great shakes. And the lower basin in California will, in fact, get wet. I mean, that's pretty much in the bank. And just so everybody understands, this is a really big El Nino. It's going to be about 3 on that chart. So it's kind of off the top there where the star is. So, I mean, we might have a wet winter, but history doesn't give us a whole lot of support. All right, so let's talk climate trajectory. I love this. I don't love this paper from the UK that complains about net zero, and then in the bottom has a picture of UK beachgoers watching the fires in France. So our emissions are slowing, but they're still on the rise. CO concentrations are up enormously. We're headed towards roughly 3 Celsius by 2100. We're at 1.5 already. We're going to have additional warming beyond 2100, which I want to talk about. It looks like since 2015, the rate of increase has gone up. And of course, our fossil fuel industry thinks they're going to be around forever. Great. Climate change is water change. I've been saying this for 2+ decades. You heat the planet, you're going to change the water cycle, which is heat driven. More floods, more droughts, earlier runoff, more rain, less snow. I mean, there's a whole list of stuff here. So don't think climate change is just water. It's all about the water cycle. Here's a really important chart that shows our greenhouse gas emissions. We're actively making this problem worse despite decades of scientists pleading to do something about this. And this only stops, warming only stops when this goes to 0, not when it plateaus out. It actually has to go to 0. And once that happens, you got high temperatures for hundreds of thousands of years. And we are really a long way from net 0. So this is a handicap by a well-regarded NGO. The left side of this is the chart I just showed you, roughly 50 gigatons per year of greenhouse gas emissions. They predict these emissions continue throughout the 21st century. There's our net 0 path, 2.8 at 2100. And let me make a really important point about this. So I think the media completely gets this stuff wrong because they say it'll be 2.8 at 2100 and they bemoan that. But the real story here, the real lead on this is humans in over 100 years of warming will have done effectively nothing to reduce these emissions. That's the real lead. And if you want a second lead, is it will continue to warm past 2100 as long as these emissions stay above 0. I mean, that's the story here. Not that it's 2.8 at 2100. It's that we haven't even begun to solve it if this is anywhere near true. All right, so long story. You're close to getting your badge. All right, so I just want to talk about the differences between these basins because it's really important. Lower Basin has all of 100 users. They're all fed by dam releases. They all have a federal contract. There's important growing that goes down there. There's Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson. The feds have control of this water via contracts, legislation, the Supreme Court decree, and the Interior Secretary is a water master. Let's look at Upper Basin. So there are thousands of users. Most of them just take water out of the river. They don't get a dam release. There's not much of a federal connection up here. Much of our ag is for hay, for ranching, although there are important areas in Grand Junction and Montrose. We've got a number of cities that are dependent on it. State water law controls, and it's pretty hard actually to cut back usage because under Western water law, if one user decides not to take water, well, the next user downstream can grab it. And so if we're trying to get water to Lake Powell to benefit the lower basin, you got to rethink how this gets done. So what about the disagreements that have marked the negotiations? So there's an agreement about this 1.25 million acre feet. That number shows back up, right, of reductions. There's no agreement on reductions behind this. The lower basin wants some contribution from the upper basin, maybe 5%, maybe 2%, but some kind of skin in the game. And the upper basin says no way, and until recently actually wanted to increase its uses. A whole dispute over that compact delivery or non-depletion obligation dispute. Upper basin says, no, there's no obligation over there. It's climate change. And the lower basin says, hey, imminent violation coming up. Let's talk about it in court, or potentially. And of course, litigation on both sides. Within the lower basin, the real question is, how much to follow strict priority allocation? And in particular, how much is California going to share in the shortages? How much will California bail Arizona out? And they actually, in 2019, put some water on the table. And the current plan has California, I want to say about 30% of these anticipated new cutbacks. So California actually has arguably stepped up. Within Arizona, it's a food fight, right? Because the senior users say, hey, we're senior, don't even talk about any out of priority allocation. The Yuma farmers are really protective of their large rights, but ultimately CAP is too important to go to zero. I mean, it just can't go to zero. So August 1, this EIS came out, and basically there wasn't a 7-state consensus, so the feds imposed a solution. And it covers releases from Powell and Meade. It covers the lower basin shortage amounts up to about 2 million acre feet, 3 million acre feet a year. There's no or limited upper basin actions. It's really a plan for a plan. What you're going to do is have in 2-year increments new plans over 10 years. And today the record of decision was released. And if we've got time, I can talk more about it. But it's official right now. And there's obviously lots of complaints about it. So what's all this mean for us in this room? So very limited federal powers up here. I think we're headed to some limited conservation in wet years to help solve this problem. I don't know if it's 2% or 5%, but it gets done in wet years. It doesn't get done in dry years. There's no water in dry years to send any downriver. We really need good accounting of how bad these reductions are in the upper basin. The upper basin now for 2 years has said, oh, we suffer mightily when it's dry up here, but they haven't put any numbers on it. And if you really want to address the equities, I think you need that number to compare to the pain in the lower basin. I think that's the only way you can get some equity out of this. We need to resolve this non-depletion obligation. We're going to see a lot warmer dry years ahead of us, and low flows and fires and ag. And I think at some point you may actually see adjustments in the priority system where, West Slope farmers get paid big bucks so that East Slope municipal diverters can still have some water. All right, so final slide. This image is out of a paper in Science that I and other co-authors put out in 2022. And basically the take home on this paper was if you're gonna stabilize the basin, you need cuts of 3 million acre feet in the lower basin, and you need the upper basin not to increase its demands. Not too far off from where we are thinking right now. So we gotta move beyond these outdated agreements. They don't generate any water. Upper basin's got to share some of this climate change risk and not increase use. The lower basin needs to be prepared for cuts of 3+ million acre feet a year. Ag's going to get to bear the brunt of this, and M&I's got to also help. The infrastructure realities around Hoover and Glen Canyon are critical, and we need to resolve them and figure them out. We need to resolve these tribal water claims. You know, so when the negotiations started, the idea was we're going to get a 20-year plan. So now we got 5 2-year plans, right? Which you might think is a setback, but I think we might have blundered into something actually useful, because it potentially is true adaptive management, right? Where people get to pay attention repeatedly as this evolves. Arizona is central to this solution, and CAP is going to see a whole lot less water, but it's not going to zero. And I don't know quite how that gets resolved, but I mean, that's just so clear. And despite all of these difficulties, I think we're going to see a solution. I think we're going to see a solution because the people who are involved in these negotiations are hardworking, they're really knowledgeable, they're intelligent, they have super good relationships with each other, and they know that the chips are down, and that if they don't solve it, the solution Mother Nature provides will be downright ugly. So I think we solve this. I actually do. I don't know when. I won't put bets on when. I'll go back to my global example that there's no other place on the planet like this right now. And, you know, current climate projection, not pretty, right? It's really not pretty. And we're headed to 3 Celsius and beyond, unfortunately, with really bad consequences. 10 million acre feet in the river might already actually be here. All right, so I started with Eeyore. And here's a really good Eeyore quote for you. Could be worse, not sure how, but could be. Somebody's doing question. Annie has a microphone. So we got 2 microphones here.
One quick thing. That helped organize this. Many thanks to everyone for coming. Many thanks to Annie and the Wolf Law Center, and especially Mr. Brad Udall. We got you this as a thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Called The Matriarch by a Denver woman environmental scientist painter, and it is of the headwaters. That's what the headwaters look like up there. So I thought that would be nice to get from the Coloradans too.
I was just there 2 weeks ago.
How's it look up there, guys?
You know, so my wife and I were recreating up there, and unfortunately Cameron Pass fire, right, was really close. And one of the things you see post-fire, unfortunately, is these areas are very hot, they're very dry, and they're very arid, and it's scary. The Hayman fire in 2002, I mean, it was a full-on cool forest, and nothing has grown back. For a while, so it's in Denver Water's watershed. It's really critical to them, but it's grassland, and it's probably not going back to trees. So, and I worry that near this, not here, but near this is part of where we're headed in that part of Colorado. That's in the Poudre River drainage and the Colorado. It's right there where they meet. So we got microphones, I think.
That's a Q&A for
Who's got?
Annie?
Annie.
Thank you for the talk. So when I hear people talk about water in semicircles, we often talk about the elephant in the room being like water consumption from agriculture. And so how do we include like agricultural farmers in these discussions towards, especially like ideas I see promoted about like, plant-based diets in terms of like focusing, more less development of alfalfa and more food for people and not like livestock. And how do you even include like the people that are consumers of agriculture into those conversations at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? If you're going to solve this, ag is going to be the biggest contributor. Some of ag's going to go away, unfortunately. And ag in Central Arizona actually has already gone away. Ag supplied by the Central Arizona Project Canal, because of these recent diminishments since 2020, much of it has at least been reduced. Some of it's gone back to groundwater, which is not a good thing. I wish I had a good answer for you that wasn't super simple. Let me tweak people here just a little bit and talk about alfalfa. So it's easy to hate on alfalfa because people don't eat it, but we kind of do, right? Dairy, ice cream, beef, cattle. And the idea that you're going to tell farmers not to grow alfalfa, which turns out to be a pretty good crop for them in their rotation, probably isn't going to work very well. I mean, you're probably far better off to say, hey, here's your reduced allocation. You use it as you want to. I think most people in this room who care about climate very much care about alfalfa and its water use, but I'm not sure trying to prohibit farmers from using a crop that's key in their rotation and actually has some kind of interesting benefits to how they grow is a suitable way to get there. And the Family Farm Alliance calls this crop shape, which I kind of like on some level. So, don't count me as a big fan of alfalfa, but I don't know that you can ban it or other hays. I mean, this is such a bigger discussion than just water use. It's food, and food is about 25% of carbon right now, right? So I wish I had some great answer for you, but I just wanted to give you some idea of the complexity. And let me mention one other quick thing on ag. So it's been suggested that ag shift to higher value products that use less water. One way to do that is only grow stuff in the winter, because growing in Yuma and Imperial in midsummer just is not a great idea. But when you ask a farmer to shift produce or products, you're asking them to change marketing, you're asking them to change labor, transportation, storage, equipment, knowledge. You're asking them to change a lot of things. And arguably, there's a need to sort of help this transition happen. And again, a little bit beyond my pay grade, but it is a complicated issue. It's not something that we should shy away from. And I don't want anybody to come away from this discussion, all this stuff is way too complicated to solve. I mean, that's completely wrong. But it really is going to take a deep dive to figure out how to deal with this. And I don't know. I tried to answer it, but super hard question. Who's got a mic?
My question goes back to where we started with Arizona, and I noticed that we talked a lot about Arizona. Back to Arizona at the beginning and throughout. I'm really concerned about Arizona's governor threatening a lawsuit against the prior appropriation law and threatening to take it to the Supreme Court with her war chest of money. Which I think actually the Supreme Court might be the worst place for activists to want it to go, because that would set a precedence. Whereas if our leader were to make an executive order, which is probably what may happen, we'd have an executive order that would expire. Where would if this were to happen, hopefully the latter, hopefully none, but if the latter were to happen and there was an executive order going back to Arizona, because their food is so important in the wintertime that it could be a national security issue to not have the food that they grow in our winter crops because there's too much tariff to get it from Mexico. Would the water come from California or the upper basin who's transferring it, or would we take water out of Meade and Powell to below record levels? What would happen, or would this just be up to executive order?
Oh.
Tomorrow's talk.
So some of the litigation stuff is just chest beating, right? And in case you haven't noticed, we have a midterm election coming up. And I would argue this is a big enough deal in Arizona to potentially swing that issue if the governor down there seems weak on the topic or somehow is conceited or whatever. I think we need to get past the midterms to look at this. That, you know, one of the interesting things about this, and I get asked about this a lot, is could the Trump administration play politics with this? And it turns out it's actually kind of hard to play politics because the way the basin works, there's an upper basin and a lower basin. And so if, for example, if Mr. Trump wanted to hurt Colorado, he's going to hurt Wyoming and Utah as well. Or if he wants to hurt California, he's going to hurt Nevada and Arizona as well, given the way this water gets allocated. So in some ways, the complexity here and the geographic way we've decided to allocate stuff actually protects us from political interference. I would tell you to wait until after the election and let's see what happens. But super sensitive in Arizona right now, and logically so. I mean, it's a really big deal.
Thank you so much. I'm on Boulder City Council, and this has just been absolutely incredible. One of the things I've noticed is a separation between the water supply and financial and economic projections. They seem to be divorced from each other. Is that something that you're noticing, and how can we combat that?
So elaborate just a little bit.
So for example, we're constantly provided fiscal projections 30 years out that don't include or consider water supply at all.
Yeah, well, some of that's, if I understand your question correctly, it's just hard because, I mean, Mother Nature is going to give us what she gives us, right? And I don't know if you're hinting also at some of the economic realities behind water supply. I mean, one of the bizarre things, right, is that ag 75% of the use is probably 2% of the GDP. I mean, it's just a tiny economic part of water's value, unfortunately. You know, it's also, I mean, farmers will argue, you know, critical to what they do. But if you really want to start counting nickels and dimes here, ag doesn't, you know, contribute a lot to GDP. Not that that's a great measure by any means. And so I don't know that I totally answered your question, but would happy to cover more with you later if you want.
Thank you. Brad, I was wondering if you or anyone else has calculated by acre feet how much water each year is exported in the form of forage crops from the Colorado River.
Yeah, so another really sensitive issue. And, you know, I don't know that I have a number. Peter Culp at one point in time did some work on this. There's been quite a brouhaha in Arizona where Saudi growers have been using groundwater there to grow alfalfa and then export it back home. And I think the governor actually put the kibosh on some of this recently, quite rightly so, right? I mean, you got one use of this water and letting somebody export it out for pretty low value doesn't make any sense. The Imperial Valley? Yeah, I know the Imperial Valley. I don't know the numbers in the Imperial Valley, and arguably, I mean, quite a sensitive topic. Right? You know, the one thing I would tell you about alfalfa is it's a very bulky crop, so it's really expensive to transport. Not that it can't be transported. At one point in time, there was a rumor that a bunch of these Chinese shipping containers that have to go back empty were going back full of alfalfa. I haven't tracked that down. I have no idea how to figure that out.
Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate it. As a citizen of one of the 22 tribes in Arizona, are the 22 tribes going to have a seat at the table at these next negotiations?
Yeah, so this has been an issue, right? I mean, the tribes are fully sovereign, and they've sort of been included, but mostly not included in this. They're not treated as equals. And in particular, I'll mention one tribe, the Colorado River Indian tribe, which is on the Colorado River, has probably the most senior water right in Arizona, actually. The water rights for almost 700,000 acre feet. They only get to use about 350 because they were never provided the means. They've been complaining about this, as have other tribes. Reclamation has been better since 2007, but they've still got a ways to go, I would argue. And I very much appreciate your comment. I mean, they're full-on sovereigns, and they've been really helpful in solving this. Like, Gila River Indian Community actually has taken a whole bunch of cash not to use water, thereby propping up Lake Mead over the last 5 years. And if you can make a deal like that, let's make it, you know? I mean, no one loses, as far as I can tell, in that kind of deal.
I have a question. I was here in June when you gave the talk. It was very good then, but you've made a huge amount of progress in your work since that time. I'm just wondering what your plans are for publications summarizing this or getting it out to the public, because this isn't on Zoom. This particular session isn't on Zoom tonight.
You know, somebody recently told me I need to write a book. I probably got all the material I need. It's hard to get excited about writing a book that feels like it's been written a lot, although clearly I have a little bit of a different angle. I don't know. Where's my assistant?
So this has been recorded, and if you signed up for the GWC newsletter, you will receive a copy of the recording.
No, Boulder Canyon Project Act. Boulder Canyon is actually on the Colorado River. It was the site of Hoover Dam, believe it or not. That whole area is called Boulder Canyon. And so a little confusing there. Good catch. No. Yeah, it's where Hoover Dam sits.
Hi, my name's Alan Bishop. I started a company here several years ago, continentalhydro.com. Write it down and go there. So the proposal I have is to rehydrate the western half of the United States. You know, I know you're all going crazy and I'm nuts. Okay. Here's the thing. Great Lakes have 21% of the Earth's surface fresh water, 5,340 cubic miles, and it doesn't fluctuate that much. Secondly, the Mississippi River, 640,000 cubic feet per second goes into the Gulf. Columbia River is 2/3 of that. Here's the big one. Alaska, in the current climate condition, is at this point right now 3.5 times the volume of the Mississippi River in fresh water from the snow melt and ice melt. Now, here's the key. We have plenty of water in the United States. It's in the wrong place. So how do we get it from a place of abundance to a place of need? Pipes. So my proposal, and I presented it to the environmental engineering and hydrology departments at CU, and one of the professors, which I won't name because you'll probably kill him, he said, "Alan, your idea is brilliant. Can't believe no one's thought of it." So here it is, in short. It's using the railroad beds. The railroads have 160,000 miles of bed. They own, a lot of people don't know this, but they're about the 5th largest landowners in the country. They have 100 foot on each side of the center line of the track. It is essentially level. In hydrology, that's a sweet spot for moving water. So the plan is, and I'm working with Union Pacific and Burlington Northern, is to basically rehydrate through pipelines 4, 6, and 8 foot. Here's the beauty of this whole idea. Is when you have head, in other words, you got to pump the water up to get it over a ridge. But when it comes down the other side, when you have an 8-foot diameter pipe, 500 miles long, the energy that you have is incredible.
Is there a question here?
Very good. So, yes, the question is, this discussion was how do we steal from Peter to pay Paul, but Peter has nothing. And so my question to you is, in all of the presentations this year, up north and here, it's all about the compacts and finding a way to redirect and use water we already currently have, and then it's diminishing. My question to you is, how come there's no discussion on the rehydration through moving water from places of abundance? That's my question.
There actually is some discussion about augmentation. Given its past failure, it never moves very far, that discussion. I do want to mention an article I clipped off Blue Sky today. It was a 2023 article out of The Onion. It reported that the USGS had found that everywhere on the planet Earth had the wrong amount of water.
So I today was talking with an entrepreneur who works in wastewater treatment, and he was telling me about a conversation he had with a colleague about how she worried that technological advancements in recycling water and treating wastewater into gray water, or eventually hopefully like drinking water, would be in conflict or like negate incentive to have behavioral changes, and that policy was more important. Do you think that like technological advancements and policy are like and behavioral changes are at odds with each other, or can they exist together?
So, recycling is a real thing, and it's really important. And there are people actually, there are places in the U.S. where we're doing direct potable recycling right now. The technology is fabulous. It uses a little bit of energy and requires, good maintenance and people paying attention to it. I see no conflict with it, frankly, given the water supply issues that we have and will have in the future. And it's actually some of this technology is very similar to desal. Uses these membranes that only water can go through and nothing else can. It's super powerful and useful, somewhat expensive, but.
Hey, I think that's all the time we have. Join me in Brad.